War Stories, Part 2, Angels of Mons, September 1914. It was an early afternoon on August 24th, 1914. Captain Arthur Osborne of the Dragon Guards had a nightmare a couple weeks ago. Now waiting to interrupt units of German cavalry, he looked at the thundery sky and was reminded of a verse from Revelation 12 in the Bible. And the great dragon was cast out, and his angels were cast out with him. His present surroundings added nothing to his mood. He was in the Belgian mining town of Mons, a marshy area intersected with canals and littered with towering slag heaps. He and his companions in the British Expeditionary Force (BEF) had been sent to France at the outbreak of war, facing him and the other British, French, and Belgian troops. For 1.5 million German soldiers, hell-bent on reaching Paris as part of General Schellneff's strategy to win a quick victory. In between marching for days on end, Osborne and his men faced moments of terror when they were caught by advanced German units or artillery fire. When their generals commanded them to stand and fight, they confronted hordes of enemy soldiers advancing in ranks so thick they seemed to resemble dark clouds sweeping through a green field toward them. A soldier fighting in such condition reaches a condition of exhaustion unimaginable to most people. In such a state, men reported seeing imaginary castles on the horizon, towering giants, or squadrons of charging cavalry in the far distance, all of course hallucinations. The losses of the British troops were taking disastrous. An average BEF infantry battalion of 850 men would be left with barely 30 by the time the German advance had been halted and the trenches set up. Osborne, and many others like him, could not help but feel they were living in an apocalypse times. It was during their desperate retreat that one of the strangest stories of the war arose. It was whispered that a host of angels had come to aid the British troop at Mons. Not only had the angels saved the soldiers from certain death, but they had also struck down the attacking Germans. Extraordinary enough, though, it was widely believed for decades after the war ended. During the early stages of fighting, the army authorities allowed no real news out from the battlefield, and consistence. Wild and fanatical stories had begun to circulate. War correspondent Philip Gibbs wrote the press and public since they were so desperate to know what was happening that any scrap of description, any glimmer of truth, and wild statement, rumor, fairy tale, or deliberate lie, which reached them from France or Belgium, was readingly accepted. The liars had a great time, he reflected. In this feverish atmosphere, the story of the Angels of Mons became a critical among British public, began to circulate around British public. Like all urban legends, it was always told secondhand, a friend of a friend, and learned that a friend had heard of a letter from the front which mentioned an anonymous officer had reported. The legend blossomed. Sometimes a mysterious glowing cloud featured in the story, sometimes Sometimes it was a band of ghostly horsemen or archers, or even Jo- Jonah of the Ark. But most of the time it was a host of angels that had come to rescue the Belgian British troops. Many wild stories from this time were the result of government propaganda, but the origin of this one was more incident. It was a newspaper article in the September 29 edition of London Evening News, written by freelance journalist Arthur Magician. Machin. A fanciful and rather obtuse piece of fiction. It tells of a group of British soldiers at Mons under attack by a vast paladin of German troops. As the Germans advanced towards them, and death seemed moments away, one of the soldiers mutters motto, Adist angist Santicus Georgius. May St. George be present to help the English. Just then, according to the story, the roar of the battle died down in his ears to a gentle murmur. Then be heard, or seemed to hear thousands of shouting, St. George, St. George. And as the soldiers heard these voices, he saw before him, beyond the trench, a long line of shapes with a shining about them. They were like men who drew the bow, and with another shout, the cloud of arrows flew singing and tingling through the air towards a German host, a large group of soldiers. The story had a potent mixture. England's patron saint and ghostly bowman. Spirit of those archers, perhaps, who had won the famous English victory against the French at Agincourt in 1415, perhaps. The fiction was believed to be true because it appeared in the news section of paper, probably due to problems fitting it elsewhere, or a simple misunderstanding by a designer on the paper, rather than any deliberate attempt by the evening news to mislead its readers. The original tale was preposterous enough, but in the weeks and months after it was printed, the retellings became even more fanciful. British newspapers stoked the strange hysteria by reproducing illustrations showing pious British troops praying in their trench as ranks of ghostly bowmen pour down. Deadly glowing arrows on the approaching Germans. As it swept through the country, the tale evolved, with the bowmen becoming angel archers instead. Machen never claimed his story had a grain of truth to it. The tale is mere and sheer invention, he freely admitted. I made it all up out of my own head. He was extremely embarrassed at the effect it had on British public, but the authenticity of the story was still being debated decades after the war ended. In the late 1920s, the American paper carried a report quoting German officer who declared the angels were actually motion picture images produced into the clouds by aircraft. The idea, said the officer, had been to spread terror among the British soldiers, but the plan backfired badly. When the British assumed the ghostly figures were on their side, curiously the report took it for granted that the angels had appeared. It was merely offering a logical, if extremely impossible, explanation for why they were seen. And even in 1970 and 1980, Britain's Imperial War Museum was still being asked about the authenticity of the story. Nowadays, it's easy to scoff at native Navit uh, of those who believe such stories. But the fact that the tale was so widely believed tells us much about the society that fought the war. Captain Osborne, who appears at the start of the chapter, was lucky enough to survive, but thousands of other men had been killed in the opening for months of the conflict. For those who had lost husbands or sons, there was a great need for a constellation. Stories like the Angels of Mons brought reassurance to grieving relatives. For them, it was especially pleasing to note that God was so obviously on their side of the British rather than the Germans. Other unlikely stories continue to circulate throughout the war. Some are based on the usual far-fetched tales told by troops on leave from the trenches. It was widely believed, for example, that re- renegade that a renegade international band of deserters ran loose in no man's land, the territory that lay between the opposing trenches. The other stories were deliberately fabricated by a British government propaganda unit to bolster morale at home and also lure America into war on the side of the Allies. In fact, for the most time, German military forces behaved no better or worse than any other army. But during the desperate days, early stage of war, the German army had dealt brutally with any resistance from Belgian civilians to the invasion of their country. Hostages were shot and villages massacred in res- respiratory cells. From, from the bones of such stories, British propaganda built a picture of the entire German people as a nation of godless barbarians. Huns was the term most often used. After the 4th century, soldiers of Attila, who had laid waste Rome and much of Italy. Sometimes this propaganda was almost ridiculous, and it's replaced by the bells in Belgian churches, steeples with hanging nuns. Oh. Later in the war, stories were planted in British press, saying that Germans had their own corpse factory and the Germans soldiers killed in the fighting were sent there, so their bodies could be made into explosives, candles, industrial lubricants, and boot polish. The reaction such stories produced in Britain was sometimes equally bizarre. German Dachshund dogs were stoned in the street. Shops and German immigrant owners were attacked and looted. The British royal family changed their German name of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, but mainly the stories created an atmosphere of intense fear and hatred of the enemy, as they were intended to do. Many of those who rushed the army in the opening months of the war were convinced that they were fighting for a civilian against a barbaric foe, who would rape and manipulate their wives and children should they ever cross the Channel and invade Britain. After the war, people realized that much of these news concerning the war of the German enemy had been outright lies. Newspaper would never be so openly trusted again. This attitude still persisted during the Second World War. This meant that in early stages of war, when stories of German death camps first broke, they were widely disbelieved. It was too much of an echo of the corpse factory story from 20 years before. The end of part 2.